December Tynwald proved to be a lively affair with lots of interesting debate and questions and answers. There were questions to the Chief Minister about food security and the Minister without portfolio, and we'll later hear from David Ashford and Rob Collister on the housing debate. We also have some Christmas joy on making the budget process more transparent for Speaker Juan Watterson. But first, Jason Moorhouse and some of his questions. The first one that you asked the Chief Minister was in relation to lessons learned from Tesco's takeover of ShopRite. But this soon developed into a series of questions about food security. What are your concerns with that?
There seems to be a disconnect between what the Council Ministers are actually believing and what the people are seeing. And I think it's quite important to actually pause for a moment to actually think about that. And the Council Ministers seem to believe that if we've got a boat, if we've got a supermarket that's open, then everything will be fine. And people are actually saying, no, there's an issue here. We aren't getting the items we need when we need them. And it's that simple. And it was unfortunate that the Chief Minister didn't actually give anywhere at all. It was just a case of, this is the situation and it's working from my perspective.
I mean, the Chief Minister pointed out that there have been disruptions in the past. We've had as many as 5 days where the boat hasn't sailed. Is there anything different now compared with the past that warrants some sort of action?
I think it's that movement towards a smaller number of bigger stores, and that's the issue that up until 18 months ago, if there was none in Tesco, you could go to ShopRite. If there was none in ShopRite, you could go to the Co-op, and there's greater choice, and that limiting choice is becoming an issue. But it's also that role of the government in terms of when a takeover happens, what role do they play? And it was quite interesting that moving things forward, it's now going to be well into next year that the Council of Ministers are actually going to be briefed on the takeovers and actually play a role in them. So that was enlightening.
Because, of course, Tesco now, it could have been reasonably described that Tesco had a monopoly control of food retail in the island before the takeover of the ShopRite stores. But it's absolutely the case now that it is in a monopoly situation, isn't it?
From my educational background, I would fully agree with you. From questioning the ministers, they do not see that. Both the Enterprise Minister and the Chief Minister have answered questions linked to this in the past, and they both disputed the fact that I've suggested it is a monopoly situation. But with well over 25% of the market share, Tesco are able to influence what goes on out there. Perhaps they're doing a good job, perhaps they're not, but in terms of being a monopoly, it is definitely that situation. And I think going forward there are several local monopolies that could get taken over, and the government needs to be prepared to actually be ready to take action if it's required, and if it's not required, say they're perfectly happy with the situation.
There is new legislation afoot. The Competition Act is going to be brought into force, which will be able to deal with situations like this in the future. Do you think it would have been used had the legislation been in place when Tesco took over from ShopRite?
I think when the government's got a role to play, it's a powerful hand to play. And I think when ShopRite was taken over, it was a case of the Chief Minister and I think it was the Treasury Minister were informed of the situation that morning before the press release came out and probably the contracts had been signed. Going forward, I think it's important that the government has a stake in the process at an early stage, so there is the opportunity to actually potentially put in a counter bid, potentially to actually assess the options on the table and to suggest alternatives. So I think it's important that in a small island community, the government has a voice. I'm not saying it should be able to demand change in things, but I think having a voice is important.
You had another question down about the increase in the waste gate fees. Now, this is one of the larger costs that many local authorities have, is the disposal of the waste that they collect. And you had some concern about that increase?
Yeah, I think it's, as you suggest, it's one that's coming down to local authorities, and when they're sorting the budgets out, it comes back to individuals through their rates, and the increase next year, it's going to be well above 5%, and it's going to have an impact on what people are paying for their rates bills. So I thought it was an opportune moment to actually ask the Minister what this change was really being caused by, and she referred to it in quite minute detail, which was good in some respects. But there was the issue that in terms of the hope that had been given by the previous minister that by having more paper in the incinerator it becoming more efficient, and the cost being adjusted for that, she kind of dismissed that, and that was disappointing.
Effectively, if I recall correctly, the minister said that the increases were contractually agreed well in advance, and they followed rates of inflation and various other factors, and these were part of a contract, and there's nothing much we could do about that.
Yeah, that is the case. She identified 3 core areas. She went through each area and explained why each was important. And I came back to her and said, well, in terms of these areas, we're going to get very specialist resources, very specialist staff. They're going to have an impact on the charges. So it could be quite a small factor, such as a cost of raw materials and a specialist employee. And those 2 components could have a massive impact in what happens to the charges going forward. So, yeah, I did raise concerns, and hopefully they will be considered going forward.
One of the questions that you had, which you didn't ask because the chair of the MUA was absent due to illness, was in relation to the ongoing development plans the MUA has for the wind farm at Airy Staine. Why did you not allow the deputy chair or the member, the political member for the MUA, Mr. Greenhill, to answer that question?
It was really he spoke to me about it, and it was quite clear that he felt more comfortable with Mr. Wannenberg, the chair, answering the question. And in terms of the answer, it's not time specific. I can wait until next week or possibly even into the new year. But I'd rather have an oral answer than a written answer, because I think there are related issues to the actual spend that's going on that is one thing that I keep trying to highlight with this project, that it's not a low-cost option. It's very expensive, and the costs are going up quite dramatically. We saw in terms of the consultation, £70,000. We've seen with the strips across the road to actually measure traffic and things, we're going to get another substantial cost there. And I think it's important as a representative that we actually find out what these costs are and how they're changing. So hopefully we'll get an answer next week. But if it's not next week, it'll be the new year.
Stu Peters, of course, had a motion down in Tynwald which was asking for a reset, a rethink in relation to government's net zero targets. In that debate, you made suggestions that the cost of the wind farm was going up by £1 million a month. These were very quickly, these suggestions of yours very quickly sat upon by the Treasury Minister, who basically said this is nonsense. Were you just making these figures up?
Oh, no. I actually had the newspaper headlines from the end of October with me, and people could see that. But also in terms of the documentation that came out initially in July 2023, that was quite clear that this was going to be a low-cost option. They looked at all the alternatives. That was the one we were taking forward, and that was one of the reasons. And the figure of £23 million was given to us at the presentation. It's there into the documentation. It's there in the newspaper headlines. I've asked subsequent questions about the costs, and they've gone up. It was quite interesting that we were into the 30 millions in the summer, when it was clear that even though they knocked out the possibility of the Castletown landing stage, which was going to cost over £6 million, it was still heading north. And, you think, well, there is something going on here, and the Chief Minister is calling on the departments to save £10 million when the increase in the cost of this one project is increasing by over £1 million a month. Something isn't quite right.
you were not entirely a lone voice, but you were one of the few members that supported Stu Peters' motion. Do you not realise that the mood of Tynwald is very clear on this? We need to be meeting our net zero targets. The vote in Keys was I think there was a 16-5, I think it was in Keys, and 8-0 in Ledgeco. This is an overwhelming amount of support for government's net zero targets. Why are you right and so many of your colleagues are wrong, would you suggest?
Well, I did feel to be slightly mugged by the actual amendment. The whole debate was actually not to pause, it wasn't to actually stop what was going on. It was simply for the Council of Ministers to actually review their spend and their targets, which is a healthy thing to do. And Mr. Hooper came along with an amendment that was saying that we're fully supportive of what's going on and please continue. And I felt that the two things were very different. I stood up and said, I would like there to be a review, not a pause, not a stop. And I raised concerns about things that had happened in terms of costs and the impact on the local environment. And I said, these need to be reviewed and considered. And then we had the choice of, do we actually go with continue as we are? And I thought, no, I'm not prepared to accept that. Even though that is the underlying essence of Mr. Peters' motion, I thought to actually get us all to walk through the doors and say, hurrah, this is fine as it is, was wrong. So, with the actual amendment in hand, thinking, yeah, I do agree that we should continue, I pressed the red button thinking, no, I'm not going to be just forced down this alley of supporting this because it is here in black and white, it is the right thing to do, but the priority during that motion was to actually to have some form of review, not a pause, not to stop, but to continue as we are with a review. And I felt a bit cheating in some respects. So, yeah, but I did feel it was going too far to actually say continue as we are.
Why then do you think that so many members of Tynwald are convinced that the direction of travel that was set several years ago now is absolutely the correct direction of travel, and that no changes are necessary in terms of how government's pursuing these targets?
I think one of the key differences within Tynwald today was the difference between the global agenda and the attitudes in the local area. And a lot of Tynwald member states actually focus on the global agenda and the keys to move forward. We heard about pollution in remote areas of the world. We heard about big issues. And I think those big issues actually were the things that really attracted and kept many members on side. And I feel that a small number of us who are aware of the impacts on local people, the cost impacts, the impacts on choice, the impacts on the environment, the real impacts out there, do actually need us to actually reflect on what we're doing and have some form of review, which is healthy in any democracy at any time, not to stop, not to pause, but simply to review and assess what is going on. And I felt that wasn't pushed today as it should have been. We just continued on the train to wherever we're going.
Did the vote in Tynwald reflect public opinion, do you think?
No, and to a certain extent, I don't think it really reflected what was being said in Tynwald over the past 2 days. I think in the debate there was much more nuance, much more acceptance that we are a unique place. We are a biosphere. We are a place that is incredible. In the late 90s, I came here to film Waking Dead because we are such a unique environment. And to actually say, we must do this, and this to meet all these global standards, they're important. But at the same time, we need to reflect on what we have and ensure those things are protected and move forward in a suitable way.
That was Jason Moorhouse, MHK. The Chief Minister had several questions to answer. One particular one, which developed into a question about food security. Are you really content that there are no lessons really to learn from the Tesco ShopRite takeover? And do you really believe that we have a secure situation in terms of the supply of food to people on the island?
Well, I don't think I said there were no lessons to be learned. I think the government has worked hard with suppliers to bring them up to the required standard. There has been discussions and negotiations with Tesco about their cooperation with local food suppliers and how they are going to manage those relationships. And government has also helped finance, where appropriate, to local food suppliers to reach the appropriate standards. But in terms of whether this was a matter that needed sort of referral from the Office of Fair Trading and was a threat to the overall stability of our food supply, I don't think council and ministers have ever considered that to be the case. We are bringing into force the Competitions Act. That is an act that has been sitting on the ledger, so to speak. It now needs to be enabled, and that will happen in the new year. So there is additional strength or additional purpose and ability for council and ministers to intervene should there be a threat from a takeover or merger that would effectively create an unregulated monopoly, or a monopoly that we saw as being harmful to our economy. But yeah, we've picked up on one or two matters that have arisen from the takeover, but there's no undue threat. And the food security issue is a matter that has been concerning us for some considerable time. There is obviously some disruption when boats don't sail, but the capabilities of the island to provide the core basics are there. We've got the creamery, we've got the meat plant, we've got some bread production on the island. We've certainly got good supplies of potatoes. We can ramp up the vegetables. We've seen during COVID that we are capable of meeting needs. So yes, of course there will be disruption in any situation where food supplies are seriously disrupted, but we have the capability and capacity over the island to get through that.
You did refer to an occasion previously where the boat hadn't sailed for 5 days. Of course, back then we had Ramsay Bakery, and Ramsay Bakery was used to stepping up to the plate and producing more loaves to meet the demand. We don't have that now. Certainly we have some smaller bakeries, but we don't have the capacity to meet the needs of the island for bread products if there is that significant delay. Is there any work going on behind closed doors in relation to ensuring that there is a reasonable stock of food kept, I don't know, in cold stores or wherever it may be, to ensure, particularly in stormy times of the year, that there is going to be a supply of food?
Well, that's a practical issue. I mean, the real emergencies that would occur go far beyond a few days' storm, I think, and the big concern as a national government would be around provision of food security in times of real crises. I guess you would put an exceptional weather event within that. But as I say, there is enough basic supply of food on the island for us to be able to ramp food supplies up. And yes, even with items like bread, for example, and the small amounts of bread that is being produced on the island, we could find ways to distribute that out in a sensible way. And look, there is obviously some actions and assessments that would have to be taken into consideration were those sorts of emergencies ever to occur. But we do plan for them. We do think about how we will enact that. And of course, you get into those types of levels of serious situations, you're probably then looking at some form of emergency powers to be enforced so that you could ration and distribute food accordingly. But food comes from many different sources. It's obviously, in emergencies, we often think about not just the boat, but how we could get supplies across by plane as well. So there are other ways for us to address food supply problems outside of just the boats, but it really would be going into quite exceptional circumstances for the government to start to want to intervene in those ways.
On a separate matter, you have a newly appointed minister without portfolio. It's a couple of weeks now since the minister was appointed. We had some hints in the answer that you gave in Tynwald as to what that minister would do, and it seems to be looking into driving efficiencies, looking at delivering our island plan, and also helping out in terms of external relations. What actual power does the minister have, though, to do any of those functions?
Well, he'll be given those delegations, if you like, from me. I will effectively ask him to look after that. Having a minister without portfolio is not unusual. In fact, if you look across at Westminster, I think there's one now, a minister without portfolio. The bottom line is, I have invested, as I said to Tynwald this morning, in fact, the questioner, who happened to be the former Minister for Health, who had resigned from his position, I've spent extensive time in the last 2 months plus trying to sort out this significant overspend in health. We've been through this many, many times, Phil, and the impact that's had. And I believe we are making some progress on that. I'm still investing time on that. I'm having to invest time in terms of the oversight of what an efficiencies programme is going to look like, because we've got to drive that from the centre. And of course, the other third aspect to this is, of course, a budget coming forward in February. And we know that in the current conditions that we have to make some progress from an economic perspective. We have to get on top of our cost control, and the public sector has got to be fit for purpose. So there's a number of big challenges around that as well. So having this extra resource in will enable me to concentrate on getting that £16 million down, and I've asked for that opportunity to be able to get to the end of this financial year so we can announce that. And frankly, millions of pounds of savings will mean just bringing in that extra resource for me would have been helpful and useful, delivering on the efficiencies programme, and also that contribution around whatever outcomes we get from the budget as well. So that is primarily what Tim will be doing in conjunction with myself.
The former minister, Mr. Hooper, has told us that he can't see how this is going to work, because the minister who is responsible for a particular department will have their officers doing the tasks that are required within that department, and the minister will be setting the priorities for that department. Having another minister coming in and potentially overruling the minister and saying, actually, no, I need your staff to do something else, I need them to be engaged in driving efficiencies, could cause some significant problems. How do you actually envisage this working?
Well, yeah, I mean, Laurie Hooper is looking for problems because, frankly, that's his mission statement at the moment. The bottom line, it's not really that complicated. We will collegiately determine, council will vote to determine that we will find these savings, and we will roll that out, and it will be coming from the centre, and people will be expected to engage in that. You know as well as I do that should a department and a minister determine that they're going to go in a different direction, they have that legal authority, but then one will have to reflect as to whether or not they are engaged in the government programme. So very much this will be a centrally driven, bought into government programme. I don't think it's going to impact in the way that Laurie Hooper seems to think it's going to impact. I think the second phase of any savings requirements, which will be the in-year savings requirements for next year, will obviously be determined by the budget. They indeed could be a lot more tricky to achieve, and we will determine how they will be driven and supported by from the centre, but ultimately they of course will be a matter for departments, and we certainly don't intend to start into having the centre interfering with ministerial decisions when it comes to running their departments on a day-to-day basis.
So I'm guessing then, and from what you're saying, the minister will have a range of potential options supplied to him by various departments, with an opportunity then to go through them in a way that each individual minister can't, and the individual minister can say where they think some savings could be made, and then the minister without portfolio gets the opportunity to review them all and make recommendations to council of ministers. Is that the kind of thing that you're thinking about?
Well, I think, as I said to Tynwald, patience is a virtue, because everybody's getting a bit ahead of themselves and trying to predetermine what the efficiencies programme will look like. So there's, just to be absolutely clear, there's three key priorities for me at the moment. One is getting that healthcare budget back down from £16 million back to something, more reasonable. It's clear that we're going to struggle to come in on budget, but I've got to, for the sake of our reserves and for public finances, get that back down as much as we possibly can. The second element is to start bringing forward and announcing what an efficiencies and transformation program looks like, and that's going to be an ongoing piece of work. And the third element will be the budget itself and what the implications will be from that budget for the departments. And of course, we will bring clarity to that in February. But yes, there will be more requirement for further clarity as to how services are going to be delivered with the budget framework that we've got, because we've got to have absolute financial discipline moving forward.
And having this Minister for Portfolio in place to help with things like delivering elements of our island plan, presumably that will mean that we will start seeing more delivery perhaps than we've seen during the first half of your administration.
I don't think that's entirely fair. I think we can actually demonstrate that we've made a lot of progress in the key areas that we've highlighted over the first half of the administration. I think what you're seeing is a different focus being brought into, and that focus very much, that spotlight really being shone onto the way that the public sector now is operating with the budgetary pressures that we all know are existing, and the need for us to make sure that we are keeping our economy as competitive as possible with the lowest possible tax rate. So there's a real need to drive through greater focus on efficiency and reform within the public sector, and that's where you're going to see that additional focus. This doesn't mean to say that we're not going to continue with some of the headlines of our island plan to grow the island's economy, to ensure that the working population is adequately resourced, that we're tackling some of the demographic issues. But there will be, in all that, there is this additional need now to refocus in terms of what the public sector looks like for the future, what its efficiency measures are, how it's digitalising, and of course that therefore its cost base is as low as possible, but its efficiency and its delivery remain at the levels that people need to have. And of course digitalisation and other measures are going to be key to that.
Other similar sized or relatively small countries have ministers for external affairs. Is part of the role of the minister without portfolio a kind of recognition that it is just too much for the chief minister to be expected to do all of the external relations?
No, I mean, the external relations has been managed, within my portfolio, and will remain there for the time being. The point about having this additional resource really is particularly focused on this healthcare overspend, the time that I've had to devote to that. Obviously got a new minister in now, and Mr. Christian is highly capable, and we're working very collegiately together, so some of those pressures have eased. But she is committed, along with the council of ministers, as I said, to getting that spend down. But there's other issues within healthcare delivery that we need to look at, including the mandate, the operating plan, and the budget, and making sure that's aligned. And I will be asking the minister to play a collegiate role with me in terms of, and council of ministers, in terms of making sure that we've got clarity on all that. And of course, as I said, the budget and the efficiency programme as well will mean that additional resource provided by the minister without portfolio will be invaluable in allowing me to make sure my time is being properly balanced, but more importantly, that we actually do achieve what I've said we're going to achieve in reducing that spend right down from £16 million in health, ensuring we do start to bring forward a proper coordinated, cohesive £10 million savings programme, and that when we get to budget time, we're clear on the need and delivery requirements for departments to be able to operate within their budget allocations for next year.
Chief Minister Alf Cannon there. Next up, Onken MHK Rob Collister. You had some interesting comments to make in relation to the housing debate. The debate is framed around this target of 1,000 houses over the next 10 years. Is that a reasonable target? Would it have been better perhaps to have said 200 houses over the next 2 years? Where do you stand on that?
Well, I think 1,000 affordable houses over the next 10 years is a good target. I have no problems with that. My only question is that a particular Housing and Community Board was set up in 2021 by the Chief Minister with a focus of sorting out and addressing some of the serious issues we have with housing on the island at the moment. So that commitment of 1,000 new homes or housing or affordable housing units should have been made in 2021, if not in 2022, and certainly not starting in April 2025. And what I actually, at the end of my speech, I questioned the value of what the Housing and Community Board is currently doing, and I urgently ask the Chief Minister and the current Chair to actually go away and have a review of the actual remit of the structure of this committee, what they're actually doing and how they're going to improve housing situation on the island over the next few years.
And what do you think the board is doing?
Well, I think that the board is very successfully gathering a lot of data, but a lot of people are not interested in data. They want to see tangible changes. They want to see houses being built. So I gave an example that I've been the chair of planning since November 2023, and over that period we've actually brought forward around about 550 brand new housing units. I reckon, on a rough calculation, between 10 and 15% of that figure is affordable housing. So we're already achieving it. Local authorities and developers, private developers, are already doing their part. So what we should be doing, and this is a government saying the government should be doing, they should now be working with the developers and the local authorities to get those plans that have been approved, get them into actual bricks and mortar, and put them on the market within 4 years, which is the sort of planning period that they need to be built in.
You are a former commissioner for Onken, and Onken, of course, was one of the larger housing providers on the island. Is there a problem with the way in which housing is funded, particularly public sector housing across the island, and the way in which local government has to interact with central government to get permission to borrow the money?
I think some of the red tape needs to be removed. I think we need to make the system more easier and transition sort of thing, so we can transition from just getting the things off paper and put them in to actually bricks and mortar. I think more of a concern is we have to absolutely look at the issue of local authority housing. There was several funds that have been set up which has enabled local authorities to basically upgrade their current stock, and I think that was very important that the government over the past two administrations have had to do that. You know, tens of millions of pounds have been spent to bring up the current stock to a reasonably good standard. But I know within my own constituency there's a lot more issues within the local authority housing that need to be addressed. In addition to that, the government need to add more to the stock in order to meet the criteria of the demand. And what I said in my speech is, at the moment today, there's around 770 people waiting for some form of social housing or government housing. Now, that figure has reduced down from the peak of around 1,200 just a handful of years ago, but the figure has increased just over the last couple of years. So what the government now needs to do is it needs to support local authorities to continue that work about renovating and bringing properties up to a good standard, especially from an installation point of view, but also add more properties into the actual pot to lower the number of people waiting for social housing as quickly as possible over the next 5 to 10 years.
One of your public pronouncements recently was in relation to a commuted sum being made available for a development of luxury flats. Now, effectively, the law says, or the planning law says, that if you are doing a development with more than a set number of units, you have to make provision for affordable housing. There is a way out of that, and that seems to have been what's happened in relation to this particular application.
Well, I think the application you talk about is Port Erin, and there's 38 apartments. Now, just to go back to the figure, it's 25% of any units above 8. That's very clear, very transparent, and something that I, as an MHK, has always championed, and every single application that comes before me. However, if you actually look at apartments, there is a bit of a problem with the apartment. So you could support somebody on a low to medium salary to be able to obtain an apartment, say, for example, in Port Erin. Then you have the problem of the unknown factor, which is management charges. So suddenly somebody on a low to medium salary have secured their first property and then suddenly realise they're going to be hit with a management fee, which government at the time of when helping and supporting somebody does not know what the figure will be. So that is why a lot of focus is actually on properties. Plus, a lot of banks and even the government want to actually support people who are getting a freehold, not a leasehold. So that opens up another legal issue that needs to be reviewed. I'm fully in favour of people on low to medium salaries being able to access any type of property, and that includes apartment. But we do have to address some of the concerns around leasehold. We do have to address some of the concerns around the actual management charges. So in this instance, the actual local authority said, could we possibly take the commuted sum in respect of our support? Now, I asked that question during the planning meeting, and it was very clear that any local authority, say, for example, Port Erin, if they find a suitable site to offset the commuted sum, could apply to Treasury for that amount and to provide some local authority or affordable housing within the area. So that the money is there, it's up to them to apply for it and to put the business case. I would like to see a mixture of both.
So it's sort of a way to allow the development to proceed in a way that's going to be profitable, presumably for the developer, and to allow for the affordable homes to be developed somewhere else. Except, of course, that the local authority has to produce the business case, has to find the land on which to make the development. So the money could sit in Treasury's coffers and not provide the affordable housing.
Well, technically, the money could be assigned for upgrading that social housing they've already got. So they could take the money and then decide to invest in their current stock. So there's a lot of options open to the local authorities. I know a lot of people get stuck up when they sort of see a development and then believe that the money's just disappeared and there isn't going to be affordable housing. There is options to local authorities to access those funds. And I would encourage any local authority on the island, if they've got a scheme coming or if they want to put additional social housing in their area, then to speak to Treasury and see if they can actually access some of these commuted sums, because they are there to support people in the way of deficiency payments, in the way of building costs. So there's a lot of options there. I think in respect of the application itself, that site had been empty for a long period of time, and I think it will enhance the area. And I think Port Erin is starting to turn a corner, and it is starting to regenerate. And it's the same, we've done the same in Douglas, and I think it should continue in the next few years, where we get behind these development, these private schemes, because they'll only benefit the island as a whole over the years to come.
That was Onken MHK Rob Collister. Chairman of the Housing and Communities Board and now Cabinet Office Minister David Ashford MHK moved the housing motion, which had an attractive headline-grabbing objective of 1,000 affordable homes to be built by 2036. but this surely leaves open the prospect of all the houses being built in the last couple of years.
You're becoming as cynical as I am, Phil. No, I can say categorically now it's not going to be a case of nothing for 8 years and then suddenly a 2-year dash to actually try and deliver. I made very clear in my opening remarks this is from April 2025, and the reason we deliberately say that is when we need to start. So in the next financial year we need to start actually building things. I've been saying that since I became chair of the Housing Communities Board 18 months ago, that there's been enough talk, there's been enough data collected to ensure we know what we need to do. Now it's about actually building things that people can touch, feel and live in.
Is the move to, I presume, transfer all government's housing over to a housing association, is that a distraction, or is it likely to deliver any realistic and significant change?
No, long term, it's actually a fundamental part of the strategy. A housing association will prove absolutely key to this. The initial phase, of course, is for them to take on the DOI stock, which creates something that I've been worried about for many years and spoken about, of the fact that DOI is both poacher and gamekeeper. They run public sector housing, but equally they have basically the regulatory powers as well. It creates that dividing line. But what it also does is, if Tynwald does approve a housing association, and I'm not counting my chickens yet because it's still got to come back, then actually it allows the housing association to go off and build new housing, to do different things, so provide first-time buyers housing, provide affordable housing, and actually expand our housing provision on Ireland.
Mr Moorhouse, if he is to be believed, was making clear that the only thing in the report was positives about what a great thing a housing association is. So I'm guessing Tynwald members are going to lap this up. Mr Moorhouse, though, was concerned that there didn't appear to be any negatives, and I suspect, because he voted against the motion, he feels that maybe it's not quite as rosy as is being painted.
Well, as I pointed out in the debate, this isn't a debate on housing association. The report didn't go into the fundamentals of the housing association quite deliberately, because that's something that has to come back separate. That's a completely separate work stream. The report that was before Tynwald today was the government's response to the objective assessment of housing need. The housing association and how that's designed will actually come back at a later date. Mr Moorhouse did describe it as perhaps a Trojan horse, but as I pointed out, actually, if you go back in history and myth, the Greeks actually built the Trojan horse in 3 days. So if a housing association wants to be a Trojan horse in terms of their building timescales, I'll take that any day.
and of course, the thing that people listening to this interview will be exclaiming is, rather than 3 days, we're at least 3 years into this administration now, and still no new public sector houses.
And it's been a frustration, and I've been quite clear on this and fully honest since I took on the role and before I took on the role. The simple fact is you have to have the data to make sure you know what you're building and that what you're building is where the demand is and in the right place. That's all been done. The key driver, as I've said from day one of me taking on this job 18 months ago, has been we got to be in a place to now build and deliver, and that's what we need to do. But also, crucially, you mentioned there about public sector housing, and one of the things we've got to do is engage with the local authorities. One of the biggest things that, in my personal view, has held back delivery in that area, not just in the life of this administration, but actually in the life of probably 3 or 4 administrations back, has been the way housing deficiency has worked. Now, I'm not going to go into a long lecture on what housing deficiency is or how it works, but it has held things back, and I think there is a recognition now within Treasury that there needs to be a better model. I've been having conversations in that regard, and I think that we actually have found maybe a way forward, which will hopefully come forward soon, that will allow more funding to be released to local authorities in a better way for them to actually be able to drive their ambitions, because a lot of the local authorities, I know Ramsey has some very keen plans they want to get on with and expanding. Douglas has as well. I gave the figures for public sector housing over the last 15 years. I think it's grown by about 300 units in 15 years, and most of that towards the start of that 15-year period. So we need more. Public sector housing traditionally has been around about 16% of the total housing on the island, and because we haven't been building more, that percentage has been declining down to now I think about 14%. We need to ensure that appropriate public sector housing is built and keeps demand.
So I'm guessing then from what you're saying, local authorities are going to be quite pleased to hear the chair of the Housing and Communities Board saying that we need to free the system up, certainly in terms of the funding, to actually allow local authorities to get on with what they've been trying to do for many years and start building houses. And that must be a frustration to you as Housing and Communities Board chair, that you know that local authorities want to build these houses and that they are being thwarted by the system, which, as you've described, is not necessarily I'm putting words into your mouth here, but perhaps not fit for purpose.
Well, you haven't got to put words in my mouth, Phil. I mean, I've been saying it long before I was chair of Housing Communities Board. I was saying it back when I was elected as a Douglas councillor in 2008. As I just said in the debate there, I was saying back then the deficiency wasn't fit for purpose. I'm just glad finally it's being listened to. I was chair of Douglas Council's housing committee for, I think it was 4.5 years. So I know well the challenges that come within the local authorities and the frustrations that come with that as well, in not just getting new stock but maintaining the stock that's there. And there has to be a better way forward. Treasury recognises that. Government now recognises that. So we need to work with the local authorities to be able to deliver on their priorities. I think the problem is as well in the past, perhaps public sector housing has been seen as a debt rather than an asset. And it's actually an asset. It actually provides housing for some of the most vulnerable in our society. And also it frees up capacity in the rental sector as well, which currently is under strain. So there's an added benefit there too. And I think we need to get into that mindset that investing in public sector housing isn't a debt, it's an asset.
Douglas North MHK David Ashford. Finally, Speaker of the House of Keys, Juan Watterson, contributed to an interesting debate on reforming the budget process. You had, well, it's your favourite topic, budget reform. You had some interesting comments to make on that.
Well, it's the same comments I've been making since 2009, and you'll remember being sat next to me for most of them. Immensely frustrating that we're going to stay in a fiscal dictatorship where the Treasury Minister is going to stand up and announce his budget in the morning, we'll vote on it at the end of the day, and the public will not have an area look in as to what's going on before it's all decided and put in the box. So that's an incredible frustration that we haven't been able to move the dial on that one at all in that period. It seems to be what people want, though, and I just can't wrap my head around that.
And I suppose it's not so much whether the public get to see this, but it's members, effectively. I don't know, it's around about 10 days notice you get on the budget, or is it 2 weeks?
It varies as to how long we get with it in private, but that is in private. The only people you can ask about it is the Treasury, so it's there's no independent advice available on it.
And what I think your amendment suggested was that we follow best practice in relation to how budgets are set.
Well, there's no single way of following best practice, but one of the Commonwealth benchmarks is that there is some availability for public engagement in the budget process, and that isn't done at the moment beforehand, during or after, and that's a flagrant disregard for those Commonwealth benchmarks.
And the Chief Minister suggested that you were leading Tynwald up dark alleys. You were with making improper suggestions to Tynwald. Was that the case?
I think I was desperately trying to lead Tynwald into the sunlit uplands of transparency. And if anyone's been dragging these things down into dark alleys and bludgeoning them, the Chief Minister's got a good record over many years now of doing that with this particular proposal.
You sort of have a success in as much as there is now going to be a select committee looking into this matter. Have you been on committees looking into this matter before?
No, I think there's success is an interesting definition there. I honestly don't believe that government has any interest in doing this at all. The fact that two ministers are going to be on the select committee will at least share the pain, but I have very low expectations of getting anything out of it.
The Treasury Minister is one of those ministers, and he did say that he recognised that there was disquiet at the whole way in which the budget is set. So perhaps there is some Christmas cheer just waiting to be distributed next year.
If you say so, Phil.
That was Russian MHK Juan Watterson. So what do you think? Do you feel government is on the right track with its food security policy? Are you worried about empty supermarket shelves after a spell of stormy weather, or are you reassured by the Chief Minister's comments? Any clearer on what the Minister without portfolio is doing? And are you pleased to see the target of 1,000 affordable homes by 2036? Is it too little too late, or do you agree that it was right to spend the past 3 years gathering evidence to ensure government builds the homes we actually need? And will we finally see a more open and transparent budgetary process? Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gorn at manxradio.com and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. I'm Phil Gorn, Gunnar Mouse and Geistachrum. Thanks for listening.